So today, going to be talking about nicotine and cannabis. And these two compounds are a little bit taboo to discuss from a medical professional perspective, but I'm going to talk about just what the research says as it relates to these compounds for cognitive metrics. And also, by extension, how it relates to gamers. This is a talk that I've done for a lot of pro teams and organizations, especially in the teams where there are a lot of players who are using. So, I know what the scene is like. I know what people are using. These are two of the most common compounds that I've seen, at least in the esports scene. Okay, so who am I? For those of you who are unaware, and I hate talking about myself, and I have to do it every single time just to briefly introduce myself, but my name is Casey. I am a dietitian by trade, and I generally consider myself a performance dietitian, which basically means I tell people what to eat in order to perform better. My background is actually in research and in neurobiology. But one of my claims to fame in the traditional sports world was how do I leverage different nutrition and supplement strategies and pharmaceutical strategies to enhance cognitive measures, even in traditional sports. So things like hand-eye coordination, reaction time in baseball, shooting accuracy in basketball, team decision making from like shot callers and stuff, quarterbacks and team captains and so on under high physical stress scenarios. I've worked in the tactical setting. I've worked with a lot more cognitive realm sports like chess grandmasters and things like that. So I've had a lot of experience in the traditional sports world at a pretty high level. I used to oversee the sports nutrition program for UCLA Athletics. I've worked with a lot of pro teams. I've worked with gold medaling Olympians. And as I said, my claim to fame was the neuro stuff. And so it was pretty seamless for me, being a gamer myself, to kind of jump over into the world of esports. And I've been working in esports for about 10 years now. And I've worked with a lot of professional teams and organizations on that front as well. But I do keep my foot in the academic world still. I still teach at a couple universities. I do scientific peer review for journals. I work with the teams and the players, and I do some advisement work for a couple different companies now. So anyway, that's me. And let's see, what was my first big break that got you noticed? Ooh, that's a good question. No one talks about that. There wasn't actually a big break. It was a very slow roll, I'll say, just to talk about my history very briefly. Almost every single working professional that I see in esports who is like a support staff person, so like a psych person, a strength coach person, PT, chiro, like all those kind of things, almost every single person I know did years of free work before they finally got paid in esports. And that was the same thing for me. So I was doing a lot of volunteer work. I was just dedicating my time and efforts to teams and streamers and players and like collegiate programs and stuff like that. And I just kept doing free talks and doing free stuff for all these people. And then, after a couple seasons, they were like, hey, we'd love to have you come back. And I was doing so much volunteer work plus my real job. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm sorry, I can't justify doing it. And a couple of the people said, hey, what if we give you some money? Will you be willing to continue to do these things? And then it's like, oh, shoot, okay, I can get paid for this? Yeah, maybe I should consider this. So yeah, proving yourself while not getting paid is really rough. Most of the support staff people are working full time and then volunteering their time for several years. And then finally, someone says, hey, we'll give you a little bit of cash for it. And then you're able to make it work that way. So anyway, here's some of the pro esports teams that I've worked with, just because I am talking to you guys who are more in the gamer space, so you might recognize some of these. And yeah. All right, enough with the boring stuff. So now let's talk about, nicotine, THC, cannabis use kind of stuff. I want to make sure that I'm very clear that I'm talking about the research as it relates to cognitive performance metrics. I'll talk a little bit on the health side as it relates to that, if it can have a direct lineup to performance. I'm not here to talk about really anything medical beyond that unless it has a direct performance hit or boon there. So this talk, again, in the medical world is a little bit taboo. And usually when they're talking about it, they're talking about like the pharmacokinetics of like these different compounds, or they're talking about like addiction rates, or they're talking about like health complications and longevity and, this and that. And so I'm trying to keep it as focused as I can reasonably on the cognitive performance stuff. And there will be some overlap, so I will mention some medical stuff. I will be very blunt and honest with you on the front end about that. But mostly I'm going to try to talk about performance. All right, so nicotine is very interesting because it is demonstrably a performance-enhancing substance. And this has been well known for decades. And I can't really get around that. This is all true stuff. In fact, we started learning about this in mental institutions. There was a lot of inpatient wards where they noticed that a lot of the people who were admitted for psych conditions, they were, chain smokers. And these chain smokers who had these mental conditions would see alleviation in their mental health conditions whenever they had just smoked. And so that was an interesting observation that led to a bunch of, testable hypotheses that researchers wanted to investigate more in subsequent decades. And nowadays, the research has been drilled down so far that we even have literature in things like Olympic level archers who are testing out these compounds, right? They're in peak health and their brains are finely tuned, and you give them a little bit of nicotine and boom, their psychomotor skills are drastically enhanced. And so that's like really compelling stuff, because a lot of the times when we're looking at substances, the people who are at the elite level tend not to be responders to those substances. And that's usually because their brains, their bodies are already so finely tuned that they're already close to their ceiling. There's not a whole lot of room for growth. Usually, nootropic compounds and cognitive enhancing compounds, they show the greatest efficacy in broken down bodies. And so things like elderly, things like people with Alzheimer's disease, that's where you tend to see the biggest benefit in a lot of nootropic compounds. But this is one of the few where we still see benefit even in young, healthy, tippy-top, finely tuned athletes, where there is still a benefit. So this is repeatable. This is demonstrable. They have shown that nicotine acutely leads to improvements in all sorts of cognitive metrics at the highest level, at the youngest, healthiest, tippy-top peak athletes. So with that all being said, there's a lot of caveats to nicotine, though. There's a lot of caveats with nicotine. When we use it in the literature, the researchers need to make sure that they have very fine-tuned protocols, right? They have to be able to know exactly what's leading to the performance improvement, and so they make sure that they get a delivery mechanism that delivers an exact dosage, for example. And most of the esports athletes that I work with, on the other hand, when they're using nicotine, it's usually vapes, or it's like the pouches. A lot of people are crazy about the pouches these days. So you either have like the Zyn pouches, or you got the vapes. Those are like the most common formulations that esports athletes that I see are ingesting nicotine. Not a whole lot of people are, chain smoking or getting like a cigar or using chewing tobacco or whatever these days. The problem with both of those is dosing. Okay, so you can have literally over a 10x difference in dose with the vapes. So it's like per puff, how much nicotine am I getting is drastically different between even like, if you're sourcing from the same guy or the same market or, shop or whatever, you get the same exact strain, whatever you're getting, whatever the brand, the cartridge, like all that kind of stuff. There's still a huge variability in nicotine per puff. Again, over 10x, which is wild. Like if someone said, oh yeah, you could be getting 50 mgs of caffeine, or you could be getting 500 mgs of caffeine, that would be crazy, right? Like, in fact, if we did the same math here, if it was 50 mgs of caffeine or essentially 1,500 mgs of caffeine, that would be absolutely wild. And that's kind of the difference that we're talking about here when we're looking at nicotine. So the dosing is wildly inconsistent, and that's one of the most popular dosing mechanisms for esports athletes, which means that a lot of athletes who do use it report benefits, but it's inconsistent. And so what you want is a reliable, repeatable effect that you know is going to happen whenever you use a substance, right? Now, depending on formulation, I mentioned that there are a couple different versions, right? So a lot of people are doing the vapes or like the pouches. Those actually have different time courses in which nicotine hits the blood. So inhalation is a little bit faster than oral ingestion. You also have things like transdermal, right? So nicotine patches, a lot of times people are wearing those. There's also things like gum chewing. So there's a lot of different formulations, and they all have different time courses for when this spikes in your body. And so based off of that, it's really tricky to give a standard recommendation for nicotine, because depending on the formulation you're choosing, it's going to be drastically different. So researchers will standardize this stuff. And if someone is looking to use nicotine, this is something that I also make a recommendation for, is that you standardize it. And I will say the best way, we'll talk about this in a second, is gum chewing. It's definitely my favorite vehicle for this. It comes in standard doses per gum, and it's been shown to be the least addictive variant of all of the nicotine formulations. And we also know, which I've talked about in some of the other lectures, is how gum chewing by itself, even if there's no nicotine in it or really anything in it, is a cognitive enhancing activity. So gum chewing by itself independently is like a nootropic, and then we stack it with other goodies. That's like a 1-2 punch, which is pretty nice. Okay, so that's on the practical implementation side. There are some downsides to nicotine. So everyone will talk about this, and the reason they talk about it is because it's true. Nicotine is highly addictive, and unfortunately, it's something that you habituate to rather quickly. This is one of the issues with, historical smokers, is they start out having, a cigarette a day, and pretty soon they're smoking a pack a day. This is because in order to get the same kick, they have to keep ramping up the dose. And similarly, if you're using any of these variants, you're going to desensitize to the nicotine for the cognitive measures as well. So when we talk about cognitive performance enhancement from nicotine, we're talking about someone who is nicotine sensitive. If you are habituated, if you are not sensitive to the nicotine, then it's not going to work. You're not going to have a repeatable impact. So you have to be nicotine sensitive, which inherently means you can't be blasting with nicotine all the time. If you are, one, you'll get addicted, which has its own health problems. But two, you're just going to quickly lose out on any benefit you get. Otherwise, you're going to have to consume like an entire bag of nicotine gum, which is just, quickly becomes impossible. What else can I say about this? The graph on the right is just kind of showing, people who become addicted relative to people who have ever used the substance. So the blue bar is people who've ever used, the orange bar is people who become addicted to it. And you can see that the ratio for nicotine is 1 in 3. It's like 24% of the 24% of the population get addicted, and 76% have ever used. So roughly 1 in 3 chance of becoming addicted to nicotine if you use, which is pretty bad odds. You contrast this with other substances. Alcohol, it's like a 1 in 10 chance of becoming addicted. Marijuana is like a 1 in 10 chance, and so on. So a lot of these other ones have a lot smaller risk profile as far as getting addicted. 1 out of 7 people have tried cocaine. Hey, yeah, it is kind of crazy, I guess. A lot of people use cocaine and have used cocaine in the past. Now, I know cocaine kind of fell out of favor, and then it's been making a little bit of a comeback. This survey was done, like 10 years ago, something like that. So it's possible that it was catching it at a strange time. But I think the more important thing is looking at the ratios of these. Those ratios should hold relatively over time. Okay. In addition to that, so nicotine has one of the highest addiction profiles or highest addiction risks compared to other substances. So it's 1 in 3. Okay. It even beats heroin, which is kind of nuts. So heroin is 1 in 4 get addicted, right? But nicotine's even more addictive than heroin, which a lot of people don't actually, kind of like, I just want to call that out right there. Because everyone talks about, oh yeah, like they're a heroin addict, right? But 1 in 3 for nicotine, 1 in 4 for heroin. So kind of nuts. So risk profile kind of high. So that needs to be considered, right? Like that absolutely has to be considered. The second thing that kind of surprised this graph doesn't include stimulants like Adderall. This is not looking at medications. So these are all like what, the government classifies as like drug substance use. So a lot of people will abuse anti-anxiety drugs for, like a lot of opiates and anxiolytics and things like that. A lot of people will abuse these drugs as a substance, but Adderall is its own category. You don't tend to see, just in general, I'm not a psychiatrist, but in general, we do see a fair amount of off-label use of Adderall, but we don't tend to see a lot of abuse of Adderall in the same way that some people will abuse alcohol or abuse tobacco. So these are all drugs that people tend to get diagnosably addicted to, is what this survey was looking at. So these are all substances that you can get diagnosably addicted to. Most people may use Adderall, but it's not because of an addiction, if that makes sense. All right, nicotine has another big downside, which is that the withdrawal symptoms hit really, really quick. So much so that it may be prohibitive for an esports athlete. I used to work with a lot of teams where they'd have like little vape breaks. They'd go out in between a scrim match or something. They go, for 10 minutes, they go out, they vape. And then they come back, they do a couple more scrims, they go back out, they have a little break, kind of like your old school smoke breaks. And the cadence that people used to take smoke breaks aligned with the withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so you used to have regularly scheduled smoke breaks that were, like once every hour or two. That used to be a thing. And that aligns with when the nicotine is kind of coming out of the system, and so you need another hit. The problem in esports is that you may not be able to step out in an hour. You may not be able to step out in 2 hours. You may be locked into like a best of 3, best of 5 kind of series, and maybe you're doing stuff in between. You're doing like some VOD review, you're getting coaching instructions, you're doing all this and that. And so you may not be able to step out and do a vape break. And some of the biggest, while there is a significant increase in performance temporarily, once withdrawal symptoms hit, it flips and you're actually worse than you were without any nicotine whatsoever. And the most impacted measures are your ability to focus and concentrate. So in some like hypermetabolizers, you'll see that literally within 30 minutes, people can be dumber, have less focus as a function of the nicotine withdrawal. And that could be really bad because it's like, okay, great. In match 1, I had, 15, 20 minutes where I felt really good. And then I didn't have a chance to step out. And then matches 2, 3, 4, 5, I sucked at because my focus, concentration were really bad. So is that trade-off worth it? Probably not. So it's something to think about with regards to this particular. And then the more habituated you are to nicotine, you're going to see that the withdrawal symptoms hit earlier and earlier and earlier. So again, something to be wary of in real life. All right, and then one other thing here that I'll mention, which is a health metric, but I think it relates to performance, is people who are regularly using vapes or like e-cigs. This leads, really any nicotine containing product, this leads to an impairment in your blood vasculature. And in another lecture that I've done here for this group, I've talked a lot about how there are some foods that we consider to be acute. There are some diet patterns that are conducive for cognitive enhancement, and then there are also some foods that in the short term are very beneficial for cognitive enhancement. And one of the main mechanisms in the short term and the long term for enhancing cognitive performance is to have enhanced blood flow. So if you have improved brain blood flow, you have enhanced cognitive performance. So things like not being dehydrated, things like berries and dark chocolate, these things enhance brain blood flow and they lead to acute cognitive performance enhancements. Diet strategies that protect the blood vasculature, that get blood flow to be really, really good, are really good for long-term cognitive performance. And so here what we see is that people who are regular users of nicotine products have, usually it's like this, it says it right here, this like vascular stiffness. But collectively what we get is this impairment in your blood vasculature. And this impairment in your blood vasculature is equivalent to being like 10 years older in your brain, which is not good. It's like you aged 10 years in your brain just because you've been a regular user. And so even in the short term, while it may be beneficial, like I mentioned, psychomotor and all sorts of acute cognitive performance, if you're chronically using, your brain is going to be like that of an old man, which kind of sucks. So again, got a question here. Isn't stopping smoking the number one thing you can do to improve health? Depends on the person. I'd say it's a big thing, especially if you're using traditional cigarettes. Yeah, it's probably one of, if not the most impactful thing that you could be doing. I think if you're abusing any substances, that's going to be high ROI. If you're not exercising, that's probably going to be high ROI. If you're lonely, that's going to be high ROI. It's hard to say because everyone has different things. But yeah, quitting smoking is absolutely a big one. All right, let's move over to cannabis. So cannabis is interesting because there's this crazy like CBD industry these days, and CBDs are very different than THC. And so I just want to highlight that real quick because THC is kind of the compound that we would typically consider the thing that makes you, gives you that high. That's when people are chasing weed and they're saying like, oh yeah, I got high off of using marijuana. It's from the THC. THC is the get high compound. CBDs, on the other hand, are kind of like this beneficial, bioactive, anti-inflammatory thing, and it's thrown into like all sorts of products these days, like lotions, and you can buy like CBD only products, and is a huge market for CBDs right now. So CBDs do not get you high. CBDs are just a beneficial, bioactive, cannabis derived compound. And we have data. And so I talk about this because this is the second most widely, inhaled product that I encounter with esports athletes is people using cannabis. And this, the get high THC compound, in addition to CBD actually, both have been shown to help out with cutting anxiety, making you much more relaxed. And as a corollary to that, if it can help you, be more relaxed and less anxious, that can help out a lot with sleep. So I know a whole lot of esports athletes who will, in the evening time, use some cannabis to help them go to sleep. and it just helps them wind down for the evening time. That's pretty typical. Now, I want to talk about what it can do, in the short term, essentially kind of like what I did for nicotine. So what does cannabis actually do? And you might have guessed, because it is mellowing you out, it's helping you relax. In short, it just makes you worse. So it makes every single psychomotor metric that we look at get significantly worse when you use cannabis. Okay, it's relaxing you so much to the point that you're slower. You're not able to focus as much because you're just like so relaxed. And as a function of that, your cognitive performance measures are all degraded. And this lasts for several hours. Okay, so after acute usage, we see a dampening in most cognitive measures for several hours. And that's kind of the big takeaway for this. I will say that if someone really, really, really struggles with sleep, and this helps them in the evening time with falling asleep, then that could lead to an improvement in cognition on the following day, just because you got better sleep. So that can happen sometimes. But if you're using it in the short term and you're using it in the daytime, you are acutely worse off following cannabis consumption. Okay. Does method of consumption, just got this question, does method of consumption matter as much for cannabis in this regard as it does for nicotine? It depends on what kind of cannabis product you're getting. So it seems like the higher the CBD ratio for the particular product that you're getting, the better off the cognitive measures are. So there are all sorts of different strains out there for different cannabis. Like if you've ever been to a cannabis shop, you're going to see so many different strains. And the ones with the highest CBD ratios tend to be the most protective of brain performance. The ones with the highest THC ratios tend to be the worst for cognitive measures. As far as actual formulation, some people do oral ingestion, right? They eat their, there might be like a THC gummy or something like that. If you're eating it versus if you're inhaling it, those are probably the two most common formulations. Eating it has a slower time course, so it'll hit your body much slower than inhalation. But because of the long duration in which cognitive performance is impaired following ingestion, I kind of don't talk about it as much, because it's like, okay, if I had, a weed brownie or gummy at 9 a.m, or I smoked, some cannabis at 9 a.m, you're still going to be impaired for several hours. So there's not much of a change there, which is why I didn't bring it up. But strictly speaking, eating it is going to hit your blood slower, and depending on what you're eating it with, it could actually stay in your blood longer, whereas inhalation tends to hit your blood faster and be out of your system a little bit faster too. All right, so for nicotine, this is something that if you want to experiment with, gum chewing and a standardized dose are the best formulations. But you have to be extremely careful that you are using this very, very rarely and infrequently. Because if you have to start creeping up your dose, then you're going to screw yourself. And, then you're going to age your brain 10 years, and then you might get hooked on it. And, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you get hooked on it, which is not good. So the gum chewing variant is the least addictive of all of the formulations, which is nice. And again, though, you do have to be very careful just because withdrawal symptoms hit really quickly. So you need to use it only strategically on a very short duration task, because if you use it on a long duration task, you're probably going to you'll be better, and then you'll be null, and then you'll be worse. And that's, you have to think and use it strategically, which is why For 99% of the people I work with, nicotine is not something I'm recommending really ever. It's a very, very unique case and situation in which I'll work with someone on nicotine as a potential ergogenic or nootropic compound or tool. For cannabis, basically never ever before or during any kind of scrim or competition or high value cognitive tasks, just don't do it. The only use case that I've seen it help is, again, in that like anxiety relaxation thing, but usually I would try other substances first. I might be looking at, like, on the food side, things like L-Theanine, or on the supplement side, maybe ashwagandha. I might be working with the sleep specialist. There are all sorts of alternatives that I would approach first before I reach for this. Cool. All right, so that is all. I promised I'd keep it short, and we're ahead of schedule, so we're doing good. Does anyone have any questions about anything?